I used to build bridges for a living. I understood stress points, tension, and how much weight a structure could take before it collapsed into the abyss. But I never calculated the breaking point of a human soul. When I found the first spike strip, hidden under a layer of fresh mountain snow, I didn't see a prank. I saw a declaration of war. My neighbor didn't just want my land, he wanted my life. And by the time the sun set on that ridge, he had already started digging the graves. The silence of the Appalachian Range is a deceptive thing. To a city ear, it sounds like peace. But to a man who has spent his life measuring the vibration of steel, it sounds like a held breath, like the world is waiting for something to break. I was 42 when the tremors in my hands became too much to ignore. I'd spent 15 years as a lead engineer, designing the very interchanges that millions of people used to flee their lives every day. I was good at it, but the stress of the city, the constant roar of the Chicago L train outside my window, and the pressure of a 1,000-ton deadline had turned my nervous system into a frayed wire. My doctor called it environmental burnout. I called it a slow-motion collapse. So we bought the Gray Ridge, 23 acres of jagged granite and ancient timber, perched so high that the clouds felt like they were trespassing on our porch. The cabin was a modest 1,500 square feet, built from cedar that had turned silver with age. It was off-grid, powered by a solar array that hummed quietly in the sun and propane tanks buried deep enough to survive a nuclear winter. "We can finally breathe here, Mark," Alina had said, her voice catching as she looked out over the valley. She was a landscape painter, a woman who saw the world in hues of ochre and indigo. For her, this wasn't just a house. It was a sanctuary where the light never stayed the same for more than an hour. But the sanctuary had a shadow. His name was Silas Vance. He didn't live in a house. He lived in a fortress of rusted machinery and bitterness about 2 miles down the ridge. The first time I met him, I was clearing brush near the edge of our property line. I heard the low, guttural chug of an old diesel engine before I saw him. He was sitting on an ATV that looked like it was held together by spite and duct tape. He didn't get off. He just sat there, his eyes pale as river stones, boring into mine. He wore a canvas jacket stained with grease and a hat that had seen too many winters. "You're the one," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mark Sterling," I said, stepping forward with an outstretched hand. I've dealt with difficult contractors and stubborn unions, but I had never felt a chill like the one that radiated off this man. He ignored my hand. He looked past me at the cabin. "That land belonged to my grandfather. My father bled for those trees, and then the banks came, the suits in their shiny shoes talking about eminent domain and tax liens. They carved up my family's heart and sold it to people like you." "I bought this through a legitimate broker, Mr. Vance," I replied, trying to keep my voice as steady as a structural beam. "The title is clear. I'm just looking for some peace, same as anyone." Silas let out a sound that was half laugh, half growl. "Peace? You think you can buy peace? You've bought a debt, boy, a debt to the Vance name, this road you're using. My great-grandfather blazed this trail with an axe before your people even knew what a mountain was. You're driving on my history." "The deed includes a perpetual easement for this road," I countered. "It's a legal right-of-way." Silas leaned forward, the smell of cheap tobacco and old resentment rolling off him. "Lawyers write things on paper, but the mountain writes things in blood. You city folk think a piece of parchment protects you. But up here, the only law that matters is who was here first." He didn't wait for a rebuttal. He slammed the ATV into gear and tore off, leaving a cloud of acrid smoke that choked the fresh mountain air. I stood there watching the dust settle, the tremors in my hands returning for the first time in weeks. I looked at the road, the only vein of gravel that connected our sanctuary to the world below. It was narrow, winding through a series of S-curves with 300-foot drops on either side. It was a masterpiece of mountain engineering. But as I looked at the tire tracks Silas left behind, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. He hadn't just been talking. He had been measuring me. He was looking at me the way a wolf looks at a fence, searching for the weak spot. I went back inside and told Alina it was just a grumpy neighbor. I told her he was a relic of a dying era. I lied to her to keep her safe. Because I knew, even then, Silas Vance wasn't going to stop until he reclaimed his heart, and he didn't care how many bodies he had to bury to do it. The first few weeks were an uneasy truce. I spent my mornings reinforcing the porch and my afternoons mapping the perimeter. I told myself that Silas Vance was just a bitter ghost haunting his own past, a man whose bark was fueled by cheap whiskey and old grudges. But the mountain has a way of stripping away your delusions. It happened on a Tuesday. Alina and I had driven down to the local town, a 40-minute trek to stock up on winter supplies. We were coming back loaded with flour, canned goods, and a new set of heavy-duty snow tires. As we rounded the final switchback before our property line, my headlights hit something that wasn't there 6 hours ago. A massive, rusted steel cattle gate was anchored into the stone banks on either side of the road. It was wrapped in heavy-duty grade 70 transport chains, secured by a padlock the size of a man's fist. I slammed on the brakes. The groceries shifted in the back with a dull thud. "Mark, what is that?" Alina's voice was small, tight with the kind of anxiety I had moved her here to escape. "Stay in the truck," I said. My heart was no longer a muscle, it was a hammer striking a hollow pipe. I stepped out into the cold mountain air. The wind howled through the gap in the gate like a mocking laugh. Taped to the center of the steel bars was a piece of plywood with jagged, hand-painted letters, "Property reclaimed. No trespassing. Vance land." I felt the familiar tremor start in my right hand. This wasn't just a gate. It was a barricade. It was a statement that our life, our sanctuary, was now a prison. I grabbed the heavy-duty bolt cutters from the truck bed. I was an engineer. I knew how to deal with physical obstacles. I walked up to the chain, the metal cold enough to stink my palms. But before the blades could touch the steel, the darkness above the ridge exploded into light. Two high-intensity LED bars mounted on an ATV blinded me. The engine roared, a mechanical beast lunging out of the pines. It skidded to a stop inches from the gate, the tires throwing gravel against my shins. Silas Vance sat there, silhouetted by the glare. He held a yellowed plastic folder in one hand and a heavy iron pipe in the other. "Don't even think about it, city boy," he rasped over the idle of the engine. "Silas, open the gate," I said, squinting against the light. "You're blocking a legal easement. This is the only way to my house." "Your house?" Silas spat, leaning over the handlebars. "I spent all morning at the county archives. I found the original 1952 survey. This road of yours, it's a logging trail that my grandfather never signed away. Your deed is built on a lie. This land has reverted to its rightful blood." "I have the title insurance, Silas. I have the court-recorded easement. You can't just decide the law doesn't apply because you're angry." "The law," Silas laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "The law is for people who live in boxes down in the valley. Up here, the law is who can hold the ground. You want through? You pay the toll, or you turn that shiny truck around and go back to Chicago." I felt the heat rising in my neck. "I'm cutting the chain, Silas. If you have a problem, call the sheriff." "I already did," he sneered, waving the folder. "And I told him I'm protecting my property from a trespasser. He's coming, but he's a cousin of mine. How do you think that conversation's gonna go for you?" I didn't wait. I felt the adrenaline override the tremors. I clamped the bolt cutters onto the chain and heaved. The metal groaned, then snapped with a violent crack that echoed off the granite walls. The heavy chain hit the dirt like a dead snake. Silas didn't move. He didn't swing the pipe. He just watched me with those dead, pale eyes. "You think you've opened a door," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "But all you've done is invite the devil to dinner." He backed the ATV into the trees, disappearing into the shadows before the dust even settled. We made it back to the cabin, but the silence was gone. That night, I sat by the window with a flashlight and my old service pistol on the table. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind sounded like Silas returning with more chain and more hate. The next morning, the sheriff did arrive. He didn't come with sirens. He came with a weary sigh and a look that said he'd rather be anywhere else. He looked at my deed, then he looked at the photocopy of the 1952 map Silas had given him. "It's a gray area, Mr. Sterling," the sheriff said, tipping his hat back. "Silas has a point about the old survey lines. Until a judge tells me otherwise, I can't force him to keep that road clear. It's a civil dispute." "A civil dispute," I shouted, pointing to the mountain. "He's trying to starve us out." "Get a lawyer," the sheriff said, climbing back into his cruiser, "and stay off his side of the line. Things get messy up here when people start crossing lines." As he drove away, I looked up at the ridge. Silas was standing there, a tiny figure against the sky, watching us through binoculars. He wasn't just blocking a road anymore. He was siege-testing my soul. The sheriff's departure left a silence that felt heavier than the mountain itself. I stood on the gravel, looking at the snapped chain, realizing that I was no longer an engineer. I was a man under siege. Silas wasn't just fighting for land. He was fighting for the right to erase my existence from this ridge. "Mark, we should just go back to the city," Alina whispered that evening. The fire in the hearth was roaring, but she was shivering. The light in her eyes, that vibrant, creative spark I had moved here to protect, was flickering. "It's just dirt and trees. It's not worth our lives." I looked at her, and then I looked at the dark windows. If we leave now, Alina, he wins, and men like Silas, they don't stop at one victory. He'll follow us with his ghosts. We have to finish this the right way. The next morning, I didn't reach for my hammer or my bolt cutters. I reached for my laptop and a stack of legal files. I drove down the mountain, past the spot where Silas had placed his gate, past his rusted fortress, and headed straight for the county records office. The building was a limestone tomb in the center of the valley town. Inside, it smelled of ammonia and decomposing paper. The clerk was a woman named Martha, whose skin looked like the parchment she guarded. When I told her the name, Vance, her eyes sharpened. "The Vances," she said, leaning back. "That family has been a thorn in this county's side since the Great Depression. They believe the dirt here has their DNA in it. I need every record on the Miller property, my property, and every quitclaim deed associated with the Vance family from 1950 to the present," I told her. For 6 hours, I sat in a booth under flickering fluorescent lights. I went through hundreds of pages of microfiche. I looked at tax liens, property transfers, and surveyor notes. Most of it was noise. But then, tucked inside a file from 1973, the year Silas claimed his father was robbed, I found the skeleton in the closet. It was a handwritten letter, notarized by a long-dead local official. Silas's father, Elias Vance, hadn't lost the land to a suit or a bank. He had been caught in a massive timber theft scheme, cutting down trees on government-protected land and selling the lumber on the black market. To avoid a 20-year prison sentence, he had signed a deal. He sold the ridge to the Miller family at a deep discount to pay his fines, and granted a perpetual and irrevocable easement to the county for the main access road. Elias Vance hadn't been a victim. He had been a criminal who traded his legacy for his freedom. But there was more. I found a second document, a modern affidavit filed just 18 months ago by Silas himself. He had attempted to claim the land was abandoned and unclaimed while it was still sitting on the market. He had lied to the state, claiming he was the sole heir to a property he knew had been legally sold decades ago. It was fraud, pure and simple. I took the photocopies to a high-end law firm in the city. My lawyer, Sarah Miller, a shark in a tailored suit, looked at the papers and smiled for the first time. "This isn't just a property dispute anymore, Mark," she said, tapping the 1973 confession. "This is a criminal history. Silas isn't protecting his heritage. He's trying to finish a scam his father started 50 years ago. We're going to file for an emergency injunction. We're going to make that road a legal no-man's land where he can't even set foot." The court date was set for the following week. I drove back up the mountain, the weight on my chest finally starting to lift. I had the truth. I had the law. I had the stress points of his argument, and I was ready to pull the trigger. As I drove past Silas's property, I saw him standing by his mailbox. He didn't move. He didn't wave his pipe. He just stood there wearing that same canvas jacket, watching my truck go by. He looked like a statue carved from hate. I thought the paper would stop him. I thought showing the truth to a judge would end the war. But as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something small. A single black crow was nailed to my front door. Its wings were spread wide, pinned to the cedar with rusted nails. Silas Vance didn't care about the law. He didn't care about the 1973 deed. He was playing a game that was much older than the courthouse. He was playing for blood. The crow on the door was just the beginning. In the city, a threat is a phone call or a legal letter. On the mountain, a threat is something you can touch, something that smells of rot. I didn't call the sheriff about the bird. I knew what he would say. It's just nature, Mark, or maybe some local kids. But I knew it was Silas. It was a signature. He was telling me that on this ridge, he was the one who decided who lived and who died. The court hearing in January was a landslide victory on paper. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Sterling, no relation, though Silas glared as if we were cousins, looked at the 1973 confession and the forged affidavits with visible disgust. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice echoing through the wood-paneled courtroom, "this court finds your claims not only baseless but potentially fraudulent. The easement stands. You are hereby ordered to remove all obstructions from the access road. Any further interference with the Sterling's property will result in immediate incarceration." I walked out of that courtroom feeling 10 feet tall. I looked at Silas in the hallway. He looked smaller, older. He didn't have his iron pipe or his ATV. He just had his bitterness. "It's over, Silas," I said as I passed him. He didn't look up. He just whispered, "The mountain doesn't care about judges, boy. The mountain only remembers who belongs to the dirt." For the next 3 months, the war turned into a grind of psychological attrition. Silas didn't use a gate anymore. That would be a direct violation of the court order. Instead, he used accidents. One Tuesday morning, I was heading down to the valley for a meeting. I hit the first S-curve and had to slam on my brakes. A massive oak tree had fallen across the road. The cut was clean, chainsaw work, but it was angled to look like a wind snap. It took me 4 hours with a hand saw and a winch to clear enough space to pass. The next week, it was a pile of 50 old tractor tires dumped in the middle of the night. Then, a load of jagged scrap metal. Every time I cleared a path, Silas was there, sitting on his ridge like a vulture, watching me sweat. I spent thousands of dollars, $600 in dump fees, $800 for a private security consultant. I installed 8 motion-activated trail cameras along the road, hidden in the hollows of trees. "I've got him now," I told Alina, showing her the first batch of footage. It was grainy, infrared, but unmistakable. Silas Vance in his canvas jacket, dragging a rusted water heater onto the road at 3:00 a.m. I took the footage to the sheriff. He watched it, chewed his tobacco, and spat into a plastic cup. "It's a misdemeanor, Mark. Littering. Maybe illegal dumping if I can get the DA to care. But in this county, we've got meth labs in the valley and a backlog of violent priors. Nobody's going to jail over a water heater." The system was failing me. The stress points I had calculated were holding, but the foundation was rotting. Alina was changing. She stopped painting. The vibrant ochres and indigos were replaced by gray sketches of the woods, sketches that looked like cages. She started jumping at every sound. A branch hitting the roof was a gunshot. The wind in the chimney was Silas's voice. "He's winning, Mark," she said one night, her voice trembling as she clutched a mug of tea. "He's taking the quiet and turning it into a weapon." I tried to fight back with the only tool I had left, the town council. I found out Silas was petitioning to have our road rezoned as heritage land. If he won, the road would be closed to all motorized vehicles to preserve the historical character of the ridge. It was a death sentence for our cabin. We'd be forced to hike 4 miles of vertical terrain just to get home. At the community meeting, the room was packed with locals. Silas stood up, leaning on a cane he didn't need, playing the part of the persecuted elder. He spoke of his grandfather's blood. He spoke of city vultures picking the bones of the mountain. The room was nodding. The momentum was sliding toward him. I stood up. I didn't give a speech. I didn't appeal to their hearts. I appealed to their sense of order. I opened my laptop and projected the 1973 timber theft confession onto the wall. I showed the documents where Silas had tried to scam the county. "This isn't about heritage," I told the council, my voice booming in the small hall. "This is about a man who thinks he's above the law. If you let him close this road, you're not protecting history. You're rewarding a criminal." The vote was unanimous. The petition was denied. I walked out into the cold night air, feeling a sense of grim satisfaction. I had beaten him again. I had dismantled his plan piece by piece. I didn't see Silas in the parking lot, but as I reached my truck, I saw a single deep scratch keyed into the driver's side door. It wasn't a random act of vandalism. It was a jagged vertical line. The first mark of a tally. Silas was done with the law. He was done with petitions. He was moving into the final phase of his design. And as an engineer, I should have known, when you keep adding pressure to a structure that refuses to bend, eventually it doesn't just break. It explodes. April arrived with a deceptive beauty. The mountain began to shed its white skin, revealing the raw, red earth beneath. The streams were swollen with snowmelt, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe that the winter of our discontent had thawed. Silas had been quiet for 3 weeks. No tires, no logs, no accidental obstructions. I told Alina it was because he had finally realized the law was a wall he couldn't climb. We started making plans again. She pulled out her oil paints, setting up her easel in the sun-drenched corner of the living room. She was working on a canvas of the ridge, not as it was now, but as it could be, a place of peace. On Thursday, the 14th of April, I had to head into the city for a final bridge inspection. It was a high-stakes job, the kind that used to make my hands shake, but the mountain had hardened me. "I'll be back by 7, I told Alina, kissing her forehead. "We'll grill those steaks we bought." "Don't forget the charcoal," she laughed, her eyes brighter than I had seen them in months. "And Mark, drive carefully, the road is still soft from the rain." At 4:47 p.m., as I was packing up my transit and tripod, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Alina. "Heading down for groceries and that charcoal you're definitely going to forget. See you tonight. Love you." I smiled, sent a quick "I love you" back, and hopped into my truck. I was making good time. The sun was a low, golden coin dropping toward the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the highway. Then at 5:23 p.m., the world ended. My phone rang. It was an unrecognized local number. "Mr. Sterling, this is Deputy Miller with the Sheriff's Department." The voice was too flat, too professional. As an engineer, I know that when a structure fails, there is often a moment of absolute silence before the crash. This was that silence. "There's been an accident, Mark, at the 3rd S-curve. You need to get here." I don't remember the drive. I remember the blur of green and gray, the scream of my tires as I took corners with a reckless disregard for the laws of physics. My mind was a chaotic loop of calculations. Speed, friction, gravity, the S-curve. That curve was the most dangerous part of the road, a sharp hairpin turn where the mountain dropped away into a jagged ravine of slate and pine. When I reached the scene, the flashing blue and red lights were a strobe light in the gathering dusk. 2 cruisers, a fire truck, and an ambulance were parked haphazardly across the road. I didn't wait for the truck to stop rolling. I jumped out, my boots skidding on the gravel. "Where is she?" I screamed. Deputy Miller caught me by the shoulders. He was a big man, but he looked small in that moment. "Mark, stay back. The recovery team is down there now." I looked over the edge. 40 feet down, Alina's white SUV was resting on its roof, crumpled like a discarded soda can. The windshield was gone. The silence of the mountain had returned, but now it was a suffocating, heavy thing. "She lost control," the deputy said, his voice trembling. "Must have hit a soft patch. The road gave way and she went over." "No," I whispered. "No, she knew this road. She knew every inch of it." I broke away from his grip. I didn't go down to the wreck, not yet. I went to the road. I went to the spot where the tire marks began to slide. I knelt in the dirt, the cold dampness soaking into my jeans. The tire tracks were straight, perfectly aligned with the center of the lane. And then, 10 feet before the turn, the rubber had chewed into the earth. The marks weren't from a slide. They were from a blowout. I brushed away a layer of dead, wet leaves. My heart stopped. Buried just beneath the surface, anchored into the subsoil with 6-inch timber screws, was a strip of blackened steel. Welded onto the steel were 4-inch triangular spikes, hand-forged, jagged, and coated in a dull primer to keep them from glinting in the sun. They weren't just nails. They were caltrops, military-grade spike strips designed to shred a tire instantly and send a vehicle careening in whatever direction physics dictated. In this case, the direction was the abyss. I looked up. The ridge where Silas Vance's house sat was visible through the break in the trees. The sun hit his windows, making them look like glowing orange eyes. He hadn't been quiet because he had given up. He had been quiet because he was a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He didn't just want me gone. He wanted me broken. I looked down at the spike strip, then at the wreck below. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The tremors in my hands vanished, replaced by a cold, mechanical stillness. I reached into the hollow of the tree where I had hidden one of my trail cameras. I pulled the SD card. The war was no longer about land. It was no longer about paper or judges. It was about the man on the ridge and the debt he had just written in blood. The night did not end at the hospital. I sat in a plastic chair in the waiting room until the sun began to bleed over the horizon, but I wasn't waiting for news. I already knew. The engineer in me had seen the structural failure of the car. The husband in me had felt the light go out of the world. Elena was gone. By 9:00 a.m., I was back on the ridge. I hadn't washed the road salt or the mountain grime from my hands. I felt like I was made of stone. I sat on my front porch, the laptop balanced on my knees. I watched the video. It was grainy, black and white infrared, but the truth doesn't need high definition. At 3:14 a.m., a figure had emerged from the tree line. He moved with the practiced ease of a man who had walked these woods for 60 years. He didn't rush. He knelt at the apex of the S-curve, his heavy canvas jacket bunching at the shoulders. He spent 20 minutes clearing the dirt, drilling the spikes into the roadbed, and meticulously layering dead leaves over the steel. He looked up once, right at the camera. He didn't see it, I had hidden it too well, but he looked through it, a smug, righteous grin breaking across his weathered face. The sound of an ATV tore through the morning stillness. Silas Vance rounded the bend, his engine chugging with that familiar, rhythmic spite. He stopped at the edge of my clearing, idling the machine. He didn't look like a man who had just committed a murder. He looked like a man coming to collect a debt. He climbed off the ATV, his heavy work boots crunching on the gravel. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He walked right up to my porch steps, his pale eyes searching mine for the break. "Heard there was some trouble down the hill," Silas said. His voice was like sandpaper on bone. "Tragic thing, mountain roads. They don't have no mercy for those who don't know 'em." I didn't speak, I didn't move, I just watched him. He held out the paper. "This here is a formal offer. I talked to my people. We'll take the property off your hands for 20,000 cash, save you the pain of coming back here. A man shouldn't live where he lost his heart. It ain't healthy." "You killed her, Silas," I said. The words didn't feel like they came from my throat. They felt like they came from the ground beneath us. Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Accidents happen, city boy. You go telling stories like that, people might think you finally snapped. The sheriff already ruled it a failure to maintain control. Case closed." "I have the camera, Silas." The chuckle died in his throat. His posture shifted, the old man act dropping away to reveal the predator underneath. You're bluffing. I swept that road. I checked every tree. You checked for trail cams, I said, tilting the laptop screen so he could see his own face in frozen infrared. You didn't check for an industrial-grade security sensor hidden in a hollowed-out knot of a dead oak. I'm an engineer, Silas. I don't just build things, I secure them. The silence that followed was absolute. Silas looked at the screen, then at me. The smugness was gone, replaced by a raw, animalistic fury. You think that little picture is gonna save you? Silas growled, his hand drifting toward the heavy iron pipe strapped to his ATV. This is my mountain. My blood is in this dirt. You're just a ghost passing through. He lunged. He was 68 years old, but he moved with the strength of a man who had spent a lifetime fighting the earth. He grabbed the front of my shirt, trying to haul me off the porch. I felt the heat of his breath, tobacco and rot. Sign the paper, he screamed. Sign it and run, or I'll bury you right next to her. In the city, I would have panicked. My hands would have shaken, but the stress points had already failed. There was nothing left to break. I reached into my waistband and pulled the Smith & Wesson. I didn't aim for his head. I didn't want him dead, not yet. I wanted him to feel the mountain push back. Crack! The gunshot shattered the silence. The bullet tore through the air and slammed into the heavy leather of his work boot, shattering the metatarsals and pinning his foot to the wooden porch step. Silas let out a scream that sounded like a wounded animal. He fell back, clutching his mangled foot, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. You shot me, he wailed, the righteous fire in his eyes replaced by cold, hard terror. You murdered me. No, Silas, I said, standing over him as I dialed the sheriff's direct line. I just performed a structural adjustment. Now we're going to sit here and wait, and you're going to look at that screen until the police arrive. I sat back down in my chair. The sun was fully up now, illuminating the ridge in a brilliant, cruel gold. I looked down at his boots, the same ones from the video, the ones with the distinctive hexagonal tread and the deep gash on the left toe. The evidence was literally leaking onto my porch. The mountain air was filled with the smell of cordite and irony. Silas Vance lay on my porch, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, his blood staining the cedar planks he had tried so hard to steal. He wasn't a mountain king anymore. He was just a broken man caught in the gears of a better-designed trap. When the sheriff's cruisers finally snaked up the S-curve, they didn't come with the casual air of a neighborly visit. They came with rifles drawn. They saw me sitting in my chair, the Smith & Wesson resting on my lap, and Silas pinned to the stairs like a moth to a board. Drop the weapon, Mark, Sheriff Miller shouted, his voice cracking with the tension of the scene. I didn't argue. I set the gun on the side table and raised my hands. The video is on the laptop, Sheriff. The man who killed my wife is on the steps, and the boots that match the crime scene are still on his feet. The next 72 hours were a clinical descent into the mechanics of justice. I was taken to the station, but I wasn't in a cell. I was in an interrogation room with a woman named Detective Sarah Vance, no relation to Silas, but she knew the breed. She was a forensic specialist brought in from the state capitol, a woman who looked at a crime scene the way I looked at a blueprint. Silas is claiming you lured him there, she said, sliding a folder across the table. He says you've been harassing him for months and that the spike strips were yours, that you set them to kill him but your wife hit them instead. He's playing the victim, Mark, and in this county a lot of people are inclined to believe a local over a city suit. Check the metal, I said. My voice was a flat line. The spike strips, they aren't store-bought. They're custom-welded. Look at the beadwork. Look at the alloy. The state forensic team didn't just look. They dissected. They recovered the 4 metal strips from the S-curve. They weren't made from scrap. They were fabricated from grade 60 rebar, a specific high-tensile steel used in heavy construction. They executed a search warrant on Silas's compound, a labyrinth of rusted sheds and lean-tos. In the back of a shed marked taxes, They found a professional-grade MIG welder and a pile of offcuts. The metallurgical signature matched perfectly. The chemical composition of the primer used on the spikes was an exact match for a half-empty can found on Silas's workbench. But the smoking gun was the boot. The bullet I had fired hadn't just stopped Silas, it had preserved the evidence. The forensic lab at the state capitol confirmed that the hexagonal tread pattern, combined with the unique wear-and-tear gash on the left toe, was a 1 in a billion match for the footprints found in the soft mud at the S-curve. Then came the digital forensics. They took Silas's phone. Despite his old mountain man persona, he had been using a burner phone to track my movements. They found photos of my truck, photos of Alina's car, and a series of text messages to a nephew in the next county boasting about how the ridge would be clean by spring. The civil dispute was dead. The accident was now a capital murder case. He didn't just want the land, Mark, Detective Vance told me on the third day, her eyes softening for the first time. He wanted the victory. He wanted to watch you leave with nothing. He's a narcissist who thought the mountain would hide his sins. I sat there looking at the photos of the evidence, the graphs, the tread matches, the chemical breakdowns. It was all so logical, so precise. As an engineer, I had spent my life believing that if the math was right, the structure would hold. The math was right. Silas Vance was going to spend the rest of his life in a 6-by-9-foot box. But as I walked out of the station into the cold April rain, I realized the math couldn't account for the silence in my house. It couldn't fix the stress point in my heart that had finally, irrevocably snapped. I had built a bridge to justice, but there was no one left to walk across it with me. The courtroom in that small valley town had never felt so cold. The trial of Silas Vance lasted exactly 11 days, but for me, it felt like a lifetime spent underwater. I sat in the front row, wearing the same black suit I had worn to Alina's funeral, watching the man who had dismantled my world. Silas didn't look like a predator anymore. Without his ATV and his mountain backdrop, he looked like a shriveled root pulled from the earth. His lawyers tried everything. They tried to claim the spike strips were for feral hogs. They tried to claim I was a city aggressor who had provoked an old man. They even tried to argue that the 1973 confession was signed under duress. But the mountain of evidence was too steep for them to climb. When the prosecution played the infrared video of Silas kneeling in the dirt at the S-curve, the courtroom went deathly silent. You could hear the mechanical ticking of the wall clock. In that grainy footage, as Silas smoothed the leaves over his death trap, the jury didn't see a heritage protector. They saw a cold-blooded killer. The jury took less than 6 hours. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Silas Vance, guilty. The word hit the air like a hammer on an anvil. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He just turned his head and looked at me, his eyes still as pale and hollow as river stones. Even as the bailiffs led him away in chains, sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, he whispered something. The reporters didn't catch it, but I did. "It's still my mountain boy." He was wrong. Silas Vance was going to die in a concrete box where the only light came from flickering fluorescence. He would never see the sun dip below the ridge again. He would never smell the pine after a spring rain. He had traded the vastness of the Appalachians for a 6-by-9 cell, all because he couldn't share the silence. I returned to the cabin one last time. The spring bloom was in full effect. The wildflowers Alina had wanted to plant were starting to peek through the soil near the porch, seeds she must have scattered before that final Thursday. I sat in my chair, the one next to her empty easel, and looked out over the valley. The road was clear now. The county had sent a crew to pave the S-curve, installing a heavy steel guardrail that glittered in the sun. The iron gate was gone, melted down for scrap. The law had won. The gray ridge was legally, indisputably mine. But as I looked at the sunset, I realized that Silas had managed to leave one final spike strip in my soul. Every time the wind howled through the eaves, I heard the engine of an ATV. Every time a branch snapped, I reached for a gun that wasn't there. The sanctuary had become a museum of what I had lost. I didn't sell the land to Silas's family. I didn't sell it to a developer. I donated it to the State Forest Service under one condition. It was to be named the Alina Sterling Memorial Preserve. No one would ever build there again. No one would ever fight over its borders. It would belong to the trees, the hawks, and the wind. I packed my truck and drove down the mountain. As I passed the S-curve, I stopped the car. I stood at the edge of the new guardrail and looked down into the ravine. I took my old bridge design journals and my engineering stamps, the symbols of the life that had brought me here, and I let them go. I am moving back to the city now. People ask me why I'd want to go back to the noise, the traffic, and the crowds. I tell them the same thing every time. In the city, you can hear the danger coming. On the mountain, the danger is already home. This story is a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful places hide the darkest hearts. If you believe Silas Vance got what he deserved, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. This was a long journey, and if you stayed until the very end, comment the word mountain, so I know who the true listeners are. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more deep dives into the stories the world tries to bury. Until next time, keep one eye on the road and the other on your neighbor. Thanks for watching.